Thank you all very much for coming to today's event. I'm really excited about it. I'm thrilled that we're going to be able to present to you a magnificent report by Catherine Zimmerman about Al-Qaeda in Yemen, about the collapse of the so-called Yemen model, and more importantly, about what we should be doing instead. And I think this is, it's always a little bit of a twofold issue when you critique policy, because on the one hand, the instant cheap defense of the policy is, well, what do you want to do instead? And there's a certain fairness to that, but there's a certain unfairness to it, of course, as well, because you say, well, I have a variety of thoughts about that, but you guys are the ones with the big military staffs and the entire intelligence community and all that kind of stuff. So, there is a reason why people on the outside tend to criticize and critique rather than offering, really detailed, workable plans. Nevertheless, it's a reasonable challenge, and it's something that we at AEI have taken up for some time, going back to 2007. At least from my perspective. I think others at AEI have been doing it for longer than that in different fields. And so we challenged Katie, and Katie challenged herself to do that here. And so actually, in addition to describing and diagnosing the problem, you'll have an opportunity to hear her talk about what we think we should do about it. But before we get there, I'm thrilled also to have a great friend and mentor and really a terrific American with me, General Jack Keane, formerly Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army, Acting Chief of Staff for a time, Commander of the Corps, being the 18th Airborne Corps, and a person who played an incredibly important role in catalyzing the surge in Iraq in 2007 and 2006 and 2007, and then making it possible for that to continue, because a lot of people have now forgotten, but we came very close to having Congress decide that we were not going to do the surge in 2007, and so winning the fight publicly was almost as important as getting the ideas over privately. So thrilled to have Jack here. I should have introduced myself. I'm sorry. I'm Fred Kagan, Director of the Critical Threats Project. I'm going to spend about a half an hour with Jack. And I want to start, Jack, by asking for you, give us the 50,000-foot view. We have been engaged in the war on terror for 14 years. Now, if you want to count it from 9/11, we'll be celebrating that tragic anniversary tomorrow. How are we doing?
Yeah. Well, first, let me thank Fred for having me here, and AEI. I have close association with this organization. I think it does a lot for this country. And I really appreciate the people that are in it and the quality of the work that takes place here. My association with Fred goes back to 2006. I got a call from Chris DeMuth, who ran this organization at the time. He knew I was playing around with an alternative strategy for Iraq. I had briefed it to Rumsfeld, no progress. Briefed it to Pace, who was the chairman, no progress. I thought we were done. And then he said, "You know Fred Kagan?" I said, "Well, I know his work, but I've never met him." He said, "Well, he's working on an alternative strategy with some people in AEI. Would you come on over and take a look at it?" So I did that I think it was in this room.
Yes, it was.
In this room. And stable of people in here. They've been working all weekend. I showed up for a couple of hours on a Sunday. It was absolutely stunning. We defined the problem the same, and we defined the solution. And then he had a level of detail that was amazing to me about what the enemy was doing and the fidelity on what the enemy was doing. I had a lot of knowledge about what the enemy was doing because I was on the Defense Policy Board, so I had top secret clearance and I was getting briefed on a regular basis, and I had people inform me to be able to develop the strategy. He had the same answer on the enemy using open sources. Absolutely remarkable. And then he had something I didn't even have. I told Rumsfeld it's going to take 8 to 10 brigades, to do this, and because he didn't want any part of any of that, and he had to fire the generals, Abbasade and Casey, to do it, and didn't want any part of that. And I don't want to oversimplify, his responses. They were very thoughtful to me and challenged me as well. But Fred says, there's only 5 brigades available in the Army. I said, well, how do you know that? He said, because it's on the internet. I said, what do you mean? The brigades that are available are on the internet? And he said, yeah, it's the Army's 4th generation model. They tell you what unit it is, when it's receiving its equipment, when it's receiving its people, when it goes through training, and then where it's going to the war. I said, that is all on the internet? And he said, yeah, absolutely on the internet. So after we fashioned our strategy together, I talked to the president about it, and then both of us talked to the vice president about it, and after that was done, that happened in one day. That night we knew that the president was going to change his strategy, not just because of us, because he was conditioned to do it, but I think we gave him some confidence to do it. Then Fred and I said, we've got to go up and talk to the Army. So we sit down in front of the Army Vice Chief of Staff, and I said, okay, how many brigades are there available to go? And he said, well, it's 5. I looked at Fred. I said, oh my God, this is unbelievable.
I still don't know how that slide got on the internet. It was the strangest thing.
It is the weirdest thing. But anyway, Fred and I began a journey then, not just intellectually in helping to change a president's mind about a strategy, but we both became part of execution because we were an advocate for Petraeus taking over, and then he asked us to go help him. And so through 2007 and 2008, every few months we were over there for a few weeks running around the country, trying to get down deep where a lot of the senior guys could not go and see what took place and see how this strategy was unfolding, and did the principles and theory that we were advocating actually work in terms of implementation. And it was working. It was pretty remarkable. And then we got together again in Afghanistan. He, before I got there, helping McChrystal, and then we both were helping Petraeus. One of the great things that I've seen in this town in the last 10 years was Fred's work on the surge to change his strategy, the thought-provoking strategy that he wrote, what he and Kim wrote. You talk about a power couple in town. Mostly a power couple has something to do socially. Talk about an intellectual power couple, Kim Kagan, Fred Kagan, unbelievable. And together they wrote a strategy on how to solve the problem, with ISIS in Syria. And then what Katie's done. Where are you, Katie? You here?
She's right here. She's right here.
Okay. So what she did, absolutely nothing short of remarkable piece of work. So I'm delighted to be here. The problem we have, we're 22 years after the World Trade Center bombing, when the Al-Qaeda and radical Islamists came after America. Of course, we didn't pay much attention. We're 16 years after the embassy bombings in Africa. We still didn't pay much attention. We threw some cruise missiles up into Afghanistan as a result of it. 15 years after the Cole, and 14 years after 9/11. Here we sit, transitioning through a Democratic president for 7 of those years in the 90s, a Republican president for 8 years, another Democratic for 7 years. And we sit here today as we're having a discussion, and we have no comprehensive strategy to defeat radical Islam. None. And that is absolutely appalling to think that we're in this kind of condition. And we don't define it, we don't explain it, we don't educate people about it, we don't use the power of the presidency to make an appeal that we're fighting an ideology that people have sincere and genuine beliefs about and are totally committed to it, much as communism was an ideology. And think back to that period of time. Most of you didn't live that period of time, but the reality is that in those days, because of the existential threat that nuclear weapons presented to the United States, and the communist ideology was the proponent of that because they held those weapons themselves, that the best universities in America had not just courses of study and scholarship on this, they had entire departments devoted to it. And out of those departments and out of that scholarship, informed people who were trying to run our government, our national security apparatus, which is, anybody who's been a part of that, are fatiguing jobs of themselves, and the lack of introspection and thought leadership is really challenging when you're dealing with that, and you need that intellectual reach back that academia gave to the prosecution of a strategy dealing with communism. And some of those people would come forward and participate in the government and go back. I mean, Henry Kissinger probably the most notable. Another one is, Gates, Condi Rice, et cetera. They were all part of that. Schultz, part of that. I speak on college campuses, and one of the things I always go when I go on a college campus, and I ask them, do you have any courses here on radical Islam or dealing with terrorism? I mean, they don't exist, much less an entire department of scholarship devoted to the study of something that is a global challenge, not just for the United States, but for the world at large. Isn't that something? How we've become so politically correct that we can't even deal with this belief system that is founded. The religion is part of it, and we have to deal with that. We can't deal with the religious aspect of it. I'm Roman Catholic, Fred's Jewish. I mean, we can't deal with that. We need Muslims to deal with this. Muslim clerics have to defeat the ideology, the wrongful interpretation of that religion and the bastardization of it that they're using. We can't deal with that. That's just dealing with the ideology. We need thought leaders and religious clerics to deal with them. We have to empower them so they have the courage to deal with that. So here we sit, after all of these years and all the people that are dead, and we still cannot define a strategy to deal with what is now a global problem, not just the United States problem, morphing into a global jihad. And that is the biggest challenge that we have.
So Jack, one of the problems that, the issue of political correctness and the difficulties that we all have talking about the degree to which this is Islam or is radical Islam or so forth, that's certainly a part of the challenge. But another part of the challenge is that we've got a discourse now, I would say, that posits basically two possible courses of action that we could take. Either we can do what President Obama has been doing, which is the offshore sort of, no boots on the ground, drones and, targeted killing and like that, or we can invade with hundreds of thousands of troops, right? And that's basically, those are the options. The president's presented us with a similar, in my view, very false dichotomy over the Iran deal. You can either do the deal or you're in favor of going to war with Iran, which I don't know hardly anybody who's in favor of going to war with Iran. Do you think that there's an unfairly excluded middle ground here? I mean, can we craft an intelligent strategy?
Indisputable. Well, first of all, the CT strategy, the so-called counterterrorism strategy that we are huge advocates of, and I think the administration is a proponent for it because it's a no-risk strategy. And very few people are put at risk in doing that on our side, and some civilians and certainly put at risk and when you're dealing with something like that. But even those, given the care that we exercise, are really kept to a minimal, and they're usually as a result of some mistake that we've made. But a counterterrorism strategy, just so you understand it, it's not a strategy. It is a military tactic designed to use a kinetic approach to kill leaders who are your opponents. And in this case, they're terrorists or part of an insurgency to overthrow a government.
Why doesn't that work? I mean, it clearly isn't working, right?
And because
why doesn't it?
It is so incredibly limited, because just think of this. If somebody is trying to overthrow a government and has some support of the people doing it, whether it was a Maoist insurgency or an Islamic insurgency, it's sort of irrelevant in that sense, because there have to be some legitimate grievances for people to support people to take up arms and be willing to risk your life to overthrow a government. There's likely genuine grievances there. And unless you address those grievances, in addition to dealing with the insurgents themselves, you don't solve the problem. Actually, you can create a much larger problem if you're not careful. The Arab Spring, I thought, was the strategic surprise of the Obama administration. He's had another one dealing with Putin and ISIS, to be sure, but it was a strategic surprise. And strategic surprise comes to every president post-World War II. And I won't bore you with the details. If you think back on it, there's never been a president who had to deal with it. Even Clinton dealt with Milosevic fighting 4 wars, for crying out loud, and losing all 4 of them. But the reality is, here comes this strategic surprise. And what are the people seeking? They're in the streets, in a dynamic, volatile part of the world where there are a lot of repressive regimes, and some of those regimes are clearly allies of the United States. And they're seeking political reform, social justice, and economic opportunity. Those are the three tenets of the demonstration. What do they really want? They want something that looks like the United States or Europe. They're seeking democracy and capitalism. But those are the tenets of the, nobody's in the streets demonstrating for radical Islam or jihad. It was about a better opportunity for themselves and for their kids, with some significant justification, I may add. So there were huge grievances against these regimes in doing it, and people were willing to die, to do that. What did we do? We pushed back on it. What did the radicals do? The state of Iran and the radical Islamist terrorist organization saw it as what? They saw it as opportunity. If there's going to be political and social upheaval as a result of that, if chaos is going to be the byproduct of it, then we're going to be all in. And we're going to take advantage of that. So you can see that being played out clearly in the country we're talking about here, Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, and it goes on. So if you're going to have a strategy to deal with countering an insurgency, your strategy cannot just be kinetic. It has to deal with the issues that are confronting any nation, which are political, economic, and social. And unless you're dealing with that, you're never going to get your handle around the problem. The great thing about counterinsurgency strategy, if you look at it and really get involved in it intellectually, it is mostly non-kinetic when you get into what a true counterinsurgency strategy is, because you have to deal with the political realities, the economic issues, and the social issues that are facing the people of that country if you're going to deal with those who are willing to take up arms against that country. You have to defeat those with the arms, to be sure, and there's a way to do that, but you also have to deal with all the rest of it. If you don't deal with it, you have a limited solution. Go back to counterterrorism. So here, we have a strategy to kill leaders. It's a tactic, and that's all it is. Case in point, Petraeus asked us to come over and help him. The week he arrived, I attended a commanders conference with him, asked me to speak to the commanders. Well, I could lay out, what the problems we had, and he could talk about where he's going. But I wanted everybody to understand how we got here and why this is as screwed up as it could possibly be. And that wasn't appropriate for him to do that. And then one of the initial things that first week I did was go up to see General Stan McChrystal, who was he was in charge of JSOC, and he was running the counterterrorism campaign, not only there, but in charge of it in the region, but principally focused there because the scale of the problem that we had in 2006. So Stan, I don't, if you know who he is, just unbelievably capable officer, very, very bright, changed how we did these operations exponentially better than we've ever done them before. Got unbelievable results. So he took me through from the very beginning, 9/11, to the present on everything that they've done, wherever they did it. And a lot of that's still classified. But anyway, so we go through all of that. And then we focus for the last hour, 3-hour briefing. Last hour, he's got all of his people there. Last hour was just dealing with Iraq itself. And then he shows me the cost, the people that were killed and wounded and the rest of it. But what they did. And it's significant what they did. So when it was finished, and I said, guys, okay, I'm not here to sprinkle gold dust on you. I really appreciate the sacrifice that's been made here. But you've got to understand what the contribution is and what the limitations of your contribution are. You've been doing this since 2003. Not immediately in 2003, let's say in the fall and then early 2004, they had some earnest capability there. So you've been at this for a little less than 3 years, and you've had enormous results in killing leaders. But despite that, we're losing a war. Iraq is right now a fractured state. This is early 2007. This is after the debacle of 2006. I said, we're losing the war. We are failing. We are going off the cliff with this Iraqi government and this Iraqi military, despite everything that you've done. And I said, you know why that is? Despite your Herculean efforts, despite your competence, despite the enormous daring and bravery that you have, it's because the fundamental strategy dealing with this insurgency is flawed. It's flawed. And you, even though you have that military tactic called killing leaders that we label as counterterrorism, that's not enough. It is important, it makes a difference, but you can't win a war with it. Because you're dealing with an ideology, and if you kill one leader, there's always another one. Is there a cost for killing a leader? Of course there is. Is there an operational payoff for it and a benefit? Of course there is. And if you kill a lot of them, it truly makes a difference. But if you don't have a strategy that's effective, that deals with the political issues of Sunnis and Shias, and doesn't deal with the issue of the Sunnis in particular, and bring them into the political process, as well as a strategy to protect the people. Now, our strategy was we were not going to protect the people, conscious decision by Abu Zaid and Rumsfeld, and two, the Iraqi security forces could not protect them. And that was the problem that Fred and I were facing when we looked at it in 2006. We're not going to get there until we put in place an urban counterinsurgency strategy on the military side is designed to protect the people. That's the main effort. But there had to be a political, social, and economic quotient to that, or you can't get there. And that was the problem that we had. So counterterrorism, it has its place, but it's not a strategy, and it'll never win a war for you. It's impossible to win a war for it because it doesn't deal with why people have grievances. It doesn't address the problem of why people are taking up arms and willing to kill and overthrow a government. It's only about killing leaders. And then with this administration, we have a very limited application even of that tactic because we're 90% drone-centric as opposed to using ground forces. Do you know what we could do with the ISIS leadership in Raqqa and the ISIS leadership in Mosul if we put special operation forces on the ground like we did in Iraq and went after these guys because they're hiding in among the people, and 75% of our air sorties that we fly in Syria, in Iraq, return with their bombs because the president has locked down the rules of engagement so stringently, no casualties. No president has ever said that to the United States military. As a result of that, we can't drop a bomb anywhere near where civilians are. We don't ever drop bombs where we think we're going to hurt civilians. But given the precision-guided munitions that we have, we can drop a bomb in a building, a part of it, and not destroy the other part of it. We can drop a bomb in a building and not break the glass across the street in another building. That's the truth of it, in terms of what we do and how we do it with that kind of precision. Do we make mistakes and people get hurt? Of course. These are weapons of war. But the reality is, al-Baghdadi has an operational headquarters and command structure in Raqqa, in among the people, and we never touch them. We never bomb them. We never do anything. So even if you're using counterterrorism strategy, let's go in there and put some people on the ground and sort out the bad guys from the good guys and kill them and capture them like we have done so successfully in the past. Not happening. So even the counterterrorism strategy that we're using is very limited, I would suggest, in its application. And unless you do the whole thing, we can't win a war. And we certainly can't use it with counterterrorism. And it should be expanded to a greater degree than what it is right now.
So, one of the remarkable things about General McChrystal is that he agrees with you. And he, as he explained in his terrific memoir, My Share of the Task,
Yeah, right.
he goes through exactly that. And he lays out all the stuff they were doing. And then he says, yeah, and we were losing.
And we're losing the war.
We were not winning the war. And so we're doing that approach very, very lightly. But that approach was failing. And it was fascinating to be with General McChrystal in Afghanistan and watch a guy with that background come in. And he did a lot with the special forces, the special mission units in Afghanistan. He improved that capability enormously.
Dramatically. Yeah.
But he never imagined that was going to be the solution.
Yeah, right.
Because he knew that it hadn't been the solution.
No, I'm glad you pointed that out. I mean, I wasn't criticizing Stan.
Oh, I know. So,
he teaches a great seminar class up at Yale for graduate students, mostly international students.
he's magnificent. He's got a new book out now called Team of Teams, and he's fantastic. But it's a fascinating experience for those of us who spend time around the military. The people who are most passionately committed to telling you that there's not just a military solution to this problem is the military, and they catch a lot of flack for that. Honestly. They catch a lot of flack on both sides because there's the military just wants to bomb stuff. Well, the truth is, in my experience, the military doesn't just want to bomb stuff. The military understands the limitations of hard power. And the military generally wants the other attributes of the U.S. government and U.S. power to be brought to bear, as General Keane was just laying out, and argue for that. And that's because they understand, I think, the limits.
Well, particularly wars that are fought in and among people.
Right.
I mean, World War II, Japan, Nazism, brute force, heavily kinetic, dealing with major military capabilities who took territory, and what we had to do was defeat those militaries and take that territory back. I mean, that's an oversimplification of what very high casualty producing, extraordinarily so, but it was a use of brute force to do it. But the wars we're fighting now, which, by the way, Max Boot has a great book out dealing with counterinsurgency, and he will demonstrate to you throughout the path of history that the form of warfare that we're dealing with is the most prevalent form of warfare, because we're preoccupied with 20th century warfare in the United States, or the Civil War itself. And what he points out, so accurately, this is the most prevalent kind of warfare, and actually, the counterinsurgents win most of the time, as opposed to the insurgents, which probably most people think is the opposite.
Yeah, there's a real mythology about that.
Yeah,
I want to, in the few minutes we have left, I want to ask you one more question, because in many respects, it's the biggest single problem out there. And I think actually what I'm about to say captures what the president thinks today and why one of the major reasons why he's pursuing the strategy he does. And it is, look, when the United States gets involved in other countries, we screw it up. And the truth of the matter is that we get that there's this non-kinetic, we get that we need to be dealing with grievances, but we're no good at it. And so, in principle that's true, but in practice, isn't it better for us just to stay out of these things, because we're just going to make it worse?
Well, that is a thought, and I think some of that thought has actually gained some resonance, because you have people saying, for example, the Middle East. The Middle East has a number of failed states, and it's destabilizing right before its eyes. So Lebanon, Syria, possibly Iraq. Some people believe with certainty it's Iraq. I'm not there yet. Certainly Libya and possibly Yemen. They're all manifestations of some form of a failed state. And the region is clearly destabilizing. So the best thing for Americans to do is, as Fred says, is just to stay away from it and just wash our hands of it and make sure it doesn't get sort of outside the region. And you know what that sounds like? That sounds like, to me, 1938, annexation of Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, 1939, Poland, 1940, Belgium, Netherlands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We had an ideology that was being espoused by our government that was absolute pollution to anybody that was listening to it. Weary by the horror of World War I were the leaders of those nations at the time. They all lived the World War I experience and the horror of those casualties. They wanted no part of that. And then they hear this drumbeat coming out of the very country that they were dealing with in World War I. They don't want to hear it. They want it to go away. We want ISIS to go away. The message is foul. Nobody can identify it. It runs against all of our values. How can anybody submit to something like that? We don't want to deal with it. That's where we are, intellectually and morally. If you subscribe to that, we will be in the same position we were with the leaders that were part of World War II. When Winston Churchill was asked a question by a media person talking about the greatest calamity in the history of the universe was World War II, where 100 million people were killed. And there's nothing that comes even close to that in any other human endeavor prior to that. And certainly he acknowledges that, and he said, yes, but it was also one of the most preventable wars we were ever involved in, because we were dealing with one country, one person, and an ideology that should have been stopped before it ever came to the execution that it took place in. So We're in charge here. I mean, choices have consequences. We can ignore this problem, and we can say this is a Middle East problem. Culturally different place than America, and a different predominant religion, different kind of place in itself, and we can say, that's not us. And I'll tell you what, when there's turmoil and disorder in the world, it is in the American interest to exercise world leadership, because nobody else is going to do it. Nobody else is going to fight for the kind of stability that the Middle East and the people in the Middle East deserve. And you can do it just based on self-interest of the United States alone. That's driving you, other than the sake of humanity. I think what we're unfolding with the migrants convulsing into Europe, and what Fred and I and others have been talking about for some time, with 260,000 dead and now 11 million displaced people out of a 23 million population. I mean, the horror of that is staggering, but we largely are indifferent to the human suffering that's taking place here. We can't, even on the progressive left, we can't get people involved to do something about the catastrophe that's unfolding before our eyes, and the barbarism of ISIS is certainly adding to all of that. And still people are just largely indifferent. But even if you can't get there because of the human catastrophe, and we truly care about people in that part of the world, which I think we should, and we have allies there and friends that we should be supporting, it's in our self-interest to stop that destabilization and the lack of political order in the world, because it will affect the security of the United States, our interest, and also the security of American people.
Jack, thank you so much.
You want to? Okay. Good seeing you, my friend.
Let's take your mic off. Of our endeavor today, to focus in a little bit more closely on Yemen and the situation there. Very honored to have Representative Hurd here with us. I have tremendous admiration for congresspeople who are prepared to take time out of their day to come talk about serious issues, especially when there are votes and so forth, and we're very appreciative that the congressman was able to take time and come here. He unfortunately will have to go back to his day job, and so will not be able to stay for questions. But I'm always enormously grateful for congressmen who are willing to come and be on panels and discuss things rather than just making presentations. And Congressman Hurd is certainly extremely well qualified for that based on his background, which I will not describe. So thank you very much. We're also thrilled to have with us Mohammed al-Basha, who was, I will just say, the de facto ambassador of Yemen to the United States for some time, no longer in that position, and now speaking entirely in a personal capacity. Obviously, someone who cares very deeply about Yemen and is very familiar with Yemen and will be able to enlighten us, I think, a lot about the situation there and how to understand it. And lastly, Catherine Zimmerman, who is our Al-Qaeda global team lead here, our senior analyst, who's been with the Critical Threats Project for 6 years now, I think. And it has been an incredible privilege to get to know Katie and work with her. And she will be presenting some of the conclusions of her report at the end of this discussion. So I think we'll start with Mohammed to tell us about how things are going in Yemen. You have about 10 minutes, so let's cover the whole thing.
Pretty bad. No, I mean, I wanted to start actually with focusing on AQAP and ISIS, and then we'll come into what's happening today. So, in December or late 2012, Ma'moon Abu Hatem, one of the AQAP commanders, who was also one of the early outspoken ISIS sympathizers, did an interview. And when the last question the journalist asked him is like, where do you see the future of the conflict in Yemen? He said, this is in 2012, he said, the two or the multiple factions in Yemen will eventually melt, crystallize around two poles, and then we're going to have a faction that's going to be the Sunnis, and Al-Qaeda is going to spearhead and be their defender. And then he said the other faction will be the Shias, and the Houthis are going to be their defenders. Now, did that become a self-fulfilling prophecy? That's the question that I was asking myself. Or did this AQ commander who was killed in couple of months ago, he was killed actually, or did he have the vision, or did he just have the good info on where we're heading in the country? Recently, there was 3 videos that came out in the past 2 months. One in Aden that showed the AQ fighting the Houthis in Aden. Another one was a video message by the de facto Emir of Al-Qaeda in Mukalla, where he specifically said that they're fighting the Houthis throughout the country. And then the third one was a video by Jalal al-Marqashi, who was one of the commanders. And he also specified that they're fighting the Houthis throughout the country. The Houthis, on the other hand, are also saying that they're fighting AQAP. So what does this mean? Is AQAP ISIS fighting the Houthis in Yemen? Yes. Is everybody that the Houthis are fighting in Yemen is AQAP? No. Is this a Sunni-Shia war in Yemen? No. So this is the introduction to what we have at this point. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, AQAP are just factions in this ongoing civil war. The civil war is getting bloodier by the day. I think the best comment that came out in the press recently was a comment by the head of the International Red Cross, where he said Yemen in 5 months became Syria in 5 years. And I completely agree with him. Going back to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, there's similarities and differences between them. Similarities in they both want bay'ah, alliance to their leaders. AQ's alliance is still to al-Zawahiri and Afghan, Pakistan Central. ISIS alliance is with allegiance is to Baghdadi in Iraq. AQAP will not target mosques, will not blow up buildings. ISIS doesn't have a problem with targeting mosques and building. For ISIS, the end justifies the mean. So they're willing to go and target soft spots. Both are recruiting tremendously at this point in Yemen. Yes, in the past few months, the household names for all the AQAP commanders were killed. But I'm actually troubled now because you have a new generation of leaders that are more violent. You have the Emir of AQAP now is Qasim al-Raymi, who orchestrated a lot of violent attacks. One of them is the Urdi hospital. And you have Abu Hamza, who's going to be a leading commander, and he's the guy that actually started supporting his men wearing head-mounted GoPro-like cameras to film and document the violence. Both groups are awash now with weapons. AQAP is actually facing a shortage in cash. ISIS are not. They have enough money. But they both don't agree with philosophically, there's differences. ISIS, their scholars, their Sharia council are young men in their 20s. AQAP have more veterans and people from the Salafi jihadi school. ISIS will execute on the spot. AQAP will try to promote jurisprudence, Sharia jurisprudence, and they will go through court before execution. In Mukalla now, we have an interesting situation where it seems that both ISIS and AQAP are in truce. because they have an enemy which they're united against, the coalition, the Houthis, and whomever is going to push for them. They, in Al-Mukalla, unfortunately, in April 15th, earlier this year, were able to seize 23 billion riyals, that's $100 million in dollars. So this $100 million were spent to support various operations. So AQAP and ISIS is a component of the crisis in Yemen. It's an important component for the U.S. We're at the eve of the anniversary of 9/11. We have to appreciate why this is a concern to the U.S. government. I think AQAP, with the new leadership, they're going to be more eager to target outside of Yemen. ISIS is more focused inwards. So are we safer today from AQAP or from all these militant groups? Obviously, we're not. But it's hard to point finger at an administration or just a government or as an institution. I think looking just at the region itself, it's a mess. No one would have predicted 10 years ago what will happen throughout the country. Today, as we speak right now, Yemen's envoy to the UN's envoy to Yemen is briefing the Security Council, and we're hoping that we could hear some good talk, because at the end of the day, all sides in Yemen need to reach a negotiated settlement, a political settlement. We're going to need a functioning state, a functioning government that has a holistic approach to deal with AQAP, to deal with how Yemen has become a wounded society. The fabric of society is melting. Violence have reached an unprecedented level. And we hope for the best. So I look forward to engaging the audience later on.
Oh yeah, I want to just ask you a quick question.
Sure.
to follow up on the specifics. And I agree that we have no interest here in blaming this administration or that administration. It's not helpful. Where the problem is, where we are, and the question is what to do about it. And I appreciate you focusing your remarks on that, and that's what we're all concerned about here. But we talk. I agree with you that we need to have some sort of functioning government, and as Katie will talk about a little bit more, that's of course our whole strategy, American strategy in Yemen, sort of relies on that, which is a problem because it doesn't exist now. But we have the Saudis and their coalition who are now engaged in warfare in Yemen, and their position is that the government is haughty, and their other position is that the government will not include the Houthis. Is that an approach? Are those sort of red lines within which one could frame a successful political outcome, in your view?
It's tough to say where the political dialogue and ongoing conversations will lead. I think at the end of the day, and I said this when I spoke in Woodrow Wilson a month before the conflict in February, we have to learn how to coexist with each other, to coexist with the different factions in the country, to coexist in the region, and you cannot eliminate one group overnight, and you cannot eradicate another group with violence. I'm not here in a podium where I will be judging and analyzing what went wrong and who's to blame, who pulled the trigger first. I think history will judge at what's going on in the country right now. But the facts are facts. You have close to 4,000 people that were wounded or killed, hundreds of kids killed, infrastructure damage that would reach $30 to $40 billion. We will need the GCC to definitely be a big part in rebuilding in Yemen, and I hope that was an undiplomatic way of answering your question.
Thank you very much. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, and hopefully I won't get rushed out of here to get down to votes. But what I want to do is kind of explain my background and connection to Yemen. It started at the very beginning of my professional career. When I graduated from Texas A&M University, the day I drove my car from San Antonio to Washington, D.C. to start my job as an undercover officer in the CIA was the day of the coal explosion in the Gulf of Aden. And I remember I was pumping gas, and this was back in the day when you always had a TV in the, in the gas station. And I was like, I wonder if I'm ever going to learn anything about Yemen. About 2 months later, I was the desk officer for Yemen. In my first trip to Sana'a, I was 22 years old, had never been to the Middle East, and I didn't know what Yemen was. I thought Yemen was the name of some dude. I went over there, and I was carrying a diplomatic pouch. And nobody told me to bring another bag to put the diplomatic pouch in, because the diplomatic pouch is this real big orange bag. And I walk out of the airport, and everybody's carrying their jambias and things like this, and I was a little unnerved, but it was great getting to learn a little about the country, and I followed it since. I spent 9 years in the CIA. I was undercover officer. I was doing the back alleys at 4 o'clock in the morning. 2 years D.C., 2 years India, 2 years Pakistan, 2 years New York, working ostensibly at the U.S. mission to the UN. And then 2 years, a year and a half in Afghanistan, where I managed all of our undercover operations. And when I look at an example of a success story in these types of conflicts, I always look to Afghanistan in 2001, in late December. Late December of 2001 was the fall of Kandahar in southern Afghanistan. We had killed about 2/3 of Al-Qaeda leadership, kicked Taliban out of the country, and we were able to do that with 400 Americans on the ground, 300 special forces, 100 CIA officers. We were able to accomplish that because we had the greatest Air Force the world had ever seen. But the real key to success was the relationships with local groups on the ground, Northern Alliance, different Pashtun groups. And I think this is an example that this is a framework we can look at when we look at Yemen. I appreciate the comment about how this is not just a Sunni-Shia battle in the region. You have tribal relationships that go back. The Houthis fought Saleh for 6 times, right? And then now they were aligned. I think what we can do in the U.S. government is we can be a little bit more engaged in the bringing the two sides to the table. I think by everything I've seen, the current UN negotiators doing a pretty good job of trying to find some kind of political framework to come to some kind of agreement. I think the agreement's going to have to be Houthis are involved in the government, and that Hadi will probably not be involved in the government. That's difficult. Especially considering that's who we're supporting, that's who we are looking to negotiate this deal. But creating some larger framework for that is important, and that's something that we can be doing now and further engage. And I'm going to not be critical of administrations, but I think we can spend a little more time on a diplomatic solution to Yemen than Iran. And the other issue is when we look at the humanitarian efforts, the blockade of Yemen, I think, is whether it's successful or not. People have different opinions, but I think we can be a little bit more aggressive in facilitating humanitarian aid into Yemen. What happened to the old days when we used to drop stuff that had big old American flags on the side, and to show that we're doing other things to help the communities. That's how we're going to show that we care. And this is a super important area. I think this Arab Brigade, what the Emiratis and the Saudis are doing, this is a short-term solution. I think this is an interesting tool that can be used in other conflicts, but it's never going to be a long-term solution of the problem, because you have to engage locals, aggressive local engagement in these areas. And we've proven time and time again, sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't, but we don't need these big troops, big boots on the ground. Ryan Crocker, former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to basically everywhere, and he's at Texas A&M University right now. Good friend. He was my ambassador when I was in Pakistan. He always says we need more pumps and wingtips on the ground, and that's going to prevent boots on the ground. And I think we can do that. And look, when you look at any insurgency or counterinsurgency, 20% of counterinsurgency is cutting the head off the snake. I think we're pretty good at that. You're absolutely right. When you cut off the head, new ones come up. Sometimes they're more dangerous, but they're always a little bit less experienced. And I would always rather have the less experienced person run the show than the more experienced. But 80% of counterinsurgency operations is population-centric things. How are we, building these communities and making sure they're flourishing? So I think there's a lot more that the U.S. government, where we can be more engaged. That's not, going to cost an insane amount of money, but making sure that we're engaged in the region with the right folks. And it all comes down to great local intelligence. It all comes down to having relationships with folks that we can trust in the region. And at the end of the day, the reason we got to stay engaged in Yemen is because of Al-Qaeda. And if we don't stop them there, they're going to be a threat here. This is nothing new, and we can't put our heads in the sand, and we got to help solve the problem there, because at the end of the day, it's going to actually be a lot cheaper for us to solve the problem there than if it comes to our shores. And especially in the time of 9/11, I was in New York on Tuesday, and we had a hearing on Homeland Security talking about 14 years later. And on September 12th at 2 o'clock in the morning, I was one of the first few employees into the Counterterrorism Center Special Operations Division, which prosecuted the war in Afghanistan. And if you would have told me then, or mentioned to me then, that it would be 14 years before another major attack happened on the homeland, I would have said you're crazy. And if I look at my pessimistic side, I would say the 9/11 Memorial in New York is not the last time we're going to have a memorial of something like that. But if I stop and think that for 14 years our diplomats, our intelligence officers, our military, our law enforcement have been operating as if it's September 12th, 2001 for 14 years, and to keep that type of momentum is incredibly hard. I know it. I've been there. I've seen it, and so I'm hopeful that we are going to get these things right. And it's good having this kind of dialogue with folks from all over, so that we talk about real solutions. I've been in Congress for 8 months, and actually 9. Feels like 9 years. I almost didn't come back from the in-district work period, and the thing that I've learned, there's not enough conversation about real solutions going on in this town. And so we're not always going to agree, but a robust dialogue on first understanding the problem, and then we can figure out the solution. And so I appreciate the invitation to be here. It's great to sit next to you, and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Congressman, and thank you very much for being part of that. He's not going anywhere. You can applaud, but he's not leaving.
I'll take the applause. Come on now, If there's any babies in here, I'll kiss them too. So just let me know. Especially from Texas or San Antonio.
But I actually do. I want to ask you a question before I turn it over to Katie to talk about her report. I'm so glad to have you here for so many reasons. But it is 9/11 anniversary week. We have possibly maybe a vote at some point on the Iran deal. I don't know. But certainly that's the big issue that's sucking up all of the oxygen. We have Iraq and Syria, ISIS, and all of that sort of stuff. And yet you're here talking with us about Yemen. And we have been able to fill a room of people who want to hear about Yemen, presumably. And we only paid about half of you. So thanks to the other half. I think that's awesome, but I want to ask you, in the scheme of things, as a congressman who's really focused on national security and really cares about these things, how important is Yemen? I mean, is this something that we are rightly here spending our time on?
Yes, it's important, right? It's important because I think in the last couple of years, I'm looking forward to your assessment, we've allowed AQAP has grown in strength. And if they grow in strength, they still have designs on the far enemy, which is the United States. And so that is why we should pay attention to it. And even though a lot of people don't know where Yemen is on a map, I always throw people off. I always say Arabia Felix to see how they respond, and it's so we have to pay attention to it. But the problem is, in this town, we may be able to look like 6 months down the road. It's hard. I get frustrated because a lot of my colleagues, I feel like, only look past lunch tomorrow. But it should be important. But here's the reality. How many conversations have I had on this in official capacity? I can't remember. And that is, now, I'm on Homeland Security. I'm also on Oversight and Government Reform. So in my, natural day-to-day things, I'm not involved in those kinds of conversations. However, as probably one of the only members of Congress that have spent time in Yemen, other than on a CODEL, there's not much engagement or conversation about this topic. Number one, Iran. Number two is ISIS. And what we should be doing with the remaining threat of Al-Qaeda is still kind of, it's hard to keep people focused on it. And that's one of the problems. That's why, having these conversations and talking about it and writing about it to make sure people understand, we can't have our head in the sands. And I think where it does come up is when you start looking about funding for the military. What are the threats? The threats. So when I was in Afghanistan, and I don't mean to. I feel like I'm in the Senate now. I'm like.
It's one of the privileges of coming to aid.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have a 2-minute clock, on me. So the issue is that when I was in Afghanistan, my unit alone was tracking about 24 credible threats to the homeland. This is 2008-9. The complexity of the threat has only increased. And we're talking about decreasing the amount of support we're giving to the warfighters. Right? That's illogical to do that. And now the ability for micro actors to have macro impact is significant. And talking about the ability to leverage social media. When I was chasing Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, they would do a night letter, write a letter, leave it on a doorstep. You can hit a couple hundred people that way. But now ISIS is really the leader in this, and how they're leveraging social media in order to get people to come by and encourage them to say, hey, this is excitement. This is get off the sofa from playing Call of Duty and come do the real thing. But where we need to be countering that message is that if you're going to go fight with ISIS in Syria or AQAP in Yemen, you're more likely to get a bomb on your head or a bullet in your chest, right? And so there is no one countering that narrative. And that's where we need to do a better job. And guess what? It's not going to come from the United States. It's going to come from our Arab partners. It's going to come from about how do you do that. So this is an area where we're really bad at doing.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Katie, please tell us what we should be doing in Yemen.
Wow. I think I want to start by reiterating a little bit about the difficulty that we're facing in Yemen. Our strategy, the U.S. strategy called the Yemen model, has been predicated on a partnership with the central government, using Yemeni security forces as the primary ground force against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. That state is gone, as Mohammed described, and it's highly fractured. The various political groupings, opposition groups, powerful elite, tribal interests, local interests, they are all aligning themselves along what we're seeing from this end as a Sunni-Shia war, but it's not because it's actually based on local power dynamics. It's a power play for Yemen's very limited natural resources and how that wealth is distributed. These are all fallouts from what happened during the 2011 Arab Spring and the solution that the United States and the international community signed on to for Yemen. These are all continued fallouts from the grievances that former Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh put down in various ways over his 3 decades of managing the country. I think that is very telling, that when we're looking at Yemen, that the problems we're facing, yes, they're manifesting in a kinetic civil war, where the Saudis have taken an unprecedented step of bombing the country and have brought together an Arab coalition, cutting across various interest groups to try to find their solution to Yemen. The problem still isn't a military one. It's coming down to the popular interests and grievances of the people. Individuals signing up to fight against the Al-Houthis, with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS. Many of those are doing those not for ideological reasons. Very few Yemenis sign up to the brand of Islam that ISIS and Al-Qaeda put forward. But they're willing to fight alongside these fighters, alongside AQAP, because it achieves some short-term objective. And that's a problem for the United States, as we've seen happen in Syria, where it actually strengthens AQAP long-term and makes it much harder for us to get rid of it down the line. And I actually think that the Wall Street Journal had a piece out this morning looking at some of those tribal militias that initially accepted AQAP's assistance and are now recognizing that the AQAP fighters are pursuing their own objectives and not really aligned with local tribal interests. So the question of what we should be doing, that's a great one. I would say that it's extremely complicated, and if you've gotten lost in all the names, there's a reason. There's also a reason why senators and congressmen don't like to talk about Yemen, because there are so many factions, because the history is so complicated. I think that we have kind of 4 primary lines of efforts that we need to be pursuing. The first one that I've laid out is a political line of effort. There are power dynamics at play, and those need to be resolved. There's not a military solution to that fight. We've seen that fight going on in Yemen right now for 8 months. It's been going on in various other ways much longer there. This is not one where one side will conquer the other. The Arab coalition that's been brought together by Saudi Arabia is actually getting bogged down to some degree, and it's unlikely that that coalition will be able to take over the capital and defeat the Al-Houthis in the military sense. Sure, there might be a way to push the Al-Houthis back to a point where they're willing to negotiate and accept some of Saudi Arabia's demands, but I'm not sure whether that is something that we're really vested in. So I think that the United States should be actually looking to lead the negotiating effort and push both the Yemenis, the Saudis, and the other Arab states to an acceptable arrangement. The Al-Houthis must be at the table. They are a legitimate opposition group. They've received backing from Iran. I think that their isolation by Saudi Arabia, by the other Arab states have driven them increasingly into Iran's arms. And there is a moderate stream within the Al-Houthis that is simply looking for legitimate grievances to be addressed. These are the grievances that led to the 6 wars that Representative Hurd mentioned earlier. Those are nothing to do with Iran. Those are local Yemeni issues. You can look forward as we're dealing with this political solution, and it means that we're going to have to cobble together some sort of government. That government needs to be acceptable. It needs to be acceptable to the Southerners. Part of the reason why we're in this mess is the Southerners sided with the Al-Houthis originally because they were representing an aggrieved opposition viewpoint. The South is now fighting against the Al-Houthis because the Al-Houthis are taking over their land. The next line of effort is one that's actually defensive for the Yemeni people. We've seen AQAP making gains in areas where AQAP had not been present before because the population couldn't defend against it or wasn't interested in defending against it because they perceived the threat from the Al-Houthis and their allies as greater. Those are the populations that actually need support, whether it be arms, money, recognizing their local government as being legitimate for the time being. There is no central state. Hadi's government is based in Saudi Arabia, is issuing decrees that don't have any play on the ground. Those need support. We can build from the ground up in Yemen. There are institutions. We say the central state has collapsed, but in a country where the central state has never had full control over the territory, that means that the U.S. mechanism for dealing with Yemen has collapsed, but the Yemenis' mechanism for governance is still there. And that's something that needs to be brought up. And I think that when you look at how populations have organized, they do have a system of governance. There's still some form of justice. They're looking for security. They will need basic supplies, et cetera. There is a value to being stitched up together into unitary state, and that's something that we should be pushing for. But we do need to be supporting on a defensive line from al-Houthi encroachment on the one end, but also from AQAP encroachment and trying to settle and resolve the local conflicts. The third line of effort is an offensive one. We do face a threat from AQAP. It has secured Al-Mukalla, which is one of Yemen's 3 major port cities. It's expanding governance there. It's secured the bank and has resources coming in. It's a port. You can move goods. And that city has served as kind of a basis of support for the front line elsewhere in Yemen. And AQAP laid this out very clearly for us. The commander that Jalal al-Makarshi that Mohammed mentioned, he went through and said, we are training Yemenis to fight. We're providing them with weapons. We're providing them with intelligence. We're providing them with supplies, et cetera. They're using their base in Al-Mukalla to support the war elsewhere. We need to get rid of that. We cannot do that through the Yemeni security forces anymore. There are a few units still there. They're isolated. They don't sit within a chain of command. They can't have support come to them. So who do we turn to? There are local forces that have tried and have voiced willingness to fight AQAP but haven't received support. I think one of the easiest examples to turn to is a major tribal coalition in Hadramaut. That's the eastern governorate where AQAP is active. When AQAP took the city of Al-Mukalla, this tribal alliance mobilized forces, went down to Al-Mukalla, and then was stopped by the Yemeni military unit that was standing there because that tribal alliance is anti-government. So we're looking at a place where a government-allied military unit prevented a force that would have assisted us in fighting AQAP from making gains because it would have thereby strengthened that force. So now that we have no central state, we need to be looking to those militia forces to serve as the tip of the spear against AQAP, supporting them, but also being very careful about who we are supporting. Of course, we'll have a vetting process, et cetera. We're not looking to enable radical elements. We're also not looking to enable those elements that aren't fighting for an eventual unified Yemeni state. Doesn't need to be centralized, but some sort of country that is existent under a central government is the end objective for the United States. And I think, yes, we'd continue U.S. direct action operations in Yemen. It's been primarily drone strikes to prevent the imminent threat from AQAP. But as we just heard General Keane lay out, killing leadership isn't the way to defeat an enemy. It hasn't been the way in Afghanistan. It hasn't been the way in Iraq. It's not going to work in Syria. We need to actually defeat these forces on the ground. The fourth line of effort that I've laid out is a humanitarian one. The conditions in Yemen, as Mohammed mentioned, have deteriorated rapidly. Before the crisis broke out, there were about 10 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. I think that number's about doubled by this time. So we have about 20 million people in a country of 25 million people. And I'm quoting an old number here, so I'm not quite sure where that stands. However way you cut it, the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Water is hard to find, food is scarce, medical supplies can't move in. Trucks aren't moving on the ground because they're afraid of being bombed by the Saudi coalition. The Houthis and AQAP have also laid landmines along the roads so no one can move goods. There is a major humanitarian crisis that's on the brink in Yemen, and the aid community is mobilized, but it's limited in what it can do. The fallout from a disaster in Yemen would be massive refugee flow, either up into Saudi Arabia or down into East Africa. Either way, it's not good for the stability of the region. I recommended a second phase that starts to knit all of this together once the conflict's de-escalated, looking at setting up an interim government and then reviewing the National Dialogue Conference process. That's what got us to the stage today. It was supposed to address all of the opposition grievances. It didn't, clearly. The international community hasn't looked at that conference and has simply accepted the outcomes from it. I think we need a hard look at the key issues. It's only about 10 to 20% of the final outcome that the opposition, the Houthis, the Southerners have a problem with. That's the hard 20% that needs to be dealt with. I'm not saying rework the entire thing, but you can't have a national dialogue that isn't actually a national dialogue. So I lay out a couple other issues and how to deal with the militia forces. Once we have some sort of central state, whether to integrate them or stand up a new Yemeni security force. These are what we need to be looking for. That's a high level of engagement from the United States, and one that I frankly haven't seen from the U.S. inside of Yemen in my time looking at the country. It's always been a second order effect. It's always been a managed threat from AQAP. I think that in order to fight this, we actually need to invest heavily in terms of people resources, but not in terms of troops on the ground and actually money.
Thanks, Katie. I want to call attention to a couple of man bites dog aspects to the discussion that we're having here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm well aware of what our reputation is. But a couple of things that I really want to highlight. First of all, it's very easy to go down the road of saying the Houthis are Shia. They're not. They're Zaidi, which is different. And saying that they're supported by Iran, which they are, and therefore they're Iranian proxies, and we should back the Saudis and anybody else who wants to fight against them the way that we back the Israelis against Hezbollah and so forth. And especially in the context of very heated arguments about Iran as a result of the deal and the sanctions being lifted and so forth, it's very easy to just see, Iranian proxy. And they may be or may become Iranian proxies. We shall see. But I agree very much with the nuanced view that Katie is presenting here, that it's not helpful. First of all, it's not true at this point. They are not an organization like Hezbollah that is controlled by Iran. There almost certainly is an opportunity to split at least part of that movement, if not all of it, away from Iran. And that's what we should be trying to do if we possibly can, because we're not in better shape if we just lump all of our potential adversaries together and treat them like a bloc such that they become a bloc. So one aspect of this is we'll be happy to fulminate about the Iran deal and all of the bad things that the Iranians are doing in the region, including supporting the Houthis. But I think that discussion has to stop at a recognition of the complexity of Yemen as so many of these things do. And also I want to point out that you're here, you're listening to presentations, and we keep coming back to the humanitarian crisis. And we can't emphasize that enough. This is across the board. This is, as General Keane pointed out, this is Syria, this is Iraq. We have tens of millions of refugees. What we're seeing in Europe is a fraction of a tip of an iceberg, and we need to stop calling those people migrants, by the way. They're not migrants. These are not people who are looking for jobs. These are people who are fleeing a Holocaust. And when you actually see pictures of what's going on in Syria, if you understand the depth of the humanitarian crisis, we are back to Hobbesian state of nature among tens of millions of people in the Middle East. That's unacceptable, in my view, from a moral ethical perspective, but it's a catastrophe from a national security perspective, because it makes those people vulnerable to recruitment by the kinds of folks who mean to take them and turn them against us and turn them against all of civilization. And we have to get our heads out of the sand on the subject of our unwillingness even to recognize the scale of the humanitarian crisis and mobilize ourselves the way we've mobilized ourselves in the past for much lesser humanitarian crises than this, by the way. And I think that this is something that we really need to address and take seriously. It's something that Katie has been very alive to. And I think that this really needs to be our focus, or one of our focuses, and not just boots on the ground or not boots on the ground. It looks like we have the congressman for a few more minutes, so let me give you the opportunity to ask some questions. I'm sorry. Please wait for the mic to come. Please identify yourself.
I can't scream. I have been
No. We have a microphone.
My name is Ali Liami. I'm from Saudi Arabia, and I run the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, which is down the road here. It cannot be in Riyadh, because if I could promote democracy in Riyadh, I don't need to do the work I do. Ms. Zimmerman, as long as the United States is catering to the Saudi needs, actually we are slaves to the Saudis. No peace can happen anywhere in the Middle East, so you have to keep that in mind. Congressman, I second Mr. Kagan comment that we need more people like you to come out and discuss these issues with us here, because as you said, nothing can be accomplished in Capitol Hill because I deal with that establishment for the last 30 years. We are engaged in Yemen up to here, but we are engaged in the wrong side. We give the Saudi and their hired coalition, they are hired, paid for to kill Yemenis. We give them information, satellite information, how to kill Yemenis. We provide them with the most sophisticated machines. They pay for it, but we provide them with that. And we help the blockade, support the blockade that Ms. Zimmerman talked about. That is actually killing Yemenis, starving them, no medicine, no water, no food, no gas, nothing.
Can
we are engaged in Yemen. The question is for you and other people in Congress, and incidentally, we are organizing a conference in Congress called it's called the Saudi Arabia, the elephant in the room. We are going to ask you to speak. The question is, how long do the United States government, including Congress, will be willing to cater to the Saudi government interest and need, which is actually against ours at this time?
Thank you very much. How about the U.S. relationship with Saudi, and is what the Saudis are doing in Yemen helpful?
So, several questions. I don't know is the answer to your question, to be frank. And our relationship with Saudi Arabia is complicated. It's constantly evolving. And we got to look first and foremost at what is our strategic objectives in these regions. And, when it comes to humanitarian aid, yes, we are involved in the blockade, and that's why it's even more important for us to help facilitate getting humanitarian support into this region, because that's how we start winning hearts and minds to make sure that we're helping people out. It's that simple for me. So, this isn't, I think this Arab Brigade has been helpful, but as I said earlier, it's not a long-term solution in the region, and that's where we have to understand and find the right partners on the ground that understand the complicated dynamics and work with them. And again, there's models that we've been successful in doing this.
Katie, I know that you've been looking at the issue of the Saudi campaign, and I think the Saudis have a problem, and the Saudis have adopted a particular solution, and it's not for us to say that that's doesn't make sense for them or does make sense for them, but we have to evaluate the degree to which it furthers our own objectives and how much we want to be supporting it. And you've been looking at an interesting dynamic having to do with what the Saudis are targeting.
Yes. I think that when you look at the Saudi air campaign and looking specifically just at the airstrikes, the first week was probably effective at halting the al-Houthi advance. It disrupted their operations. It really set them back in terms of what they were able to accomplish. For those unaware, the air campaign began on March 26th this year. The al-Houthis were on the outskirts of Aden. It was the last major holdout for President Hadi's government, which is now relocated to Saudi Arabia. And losing Aden to the al-Houthis in the sense that the al-Houthis would take full control of Aden meant that the Houthi government would have had near full control of the full Yemeni state infrastructure. The only exception at that point was it didn't have control of Marib, which is where Yemen's got kind of the liquid, it's got its petro resources there, and Hadramaut. The Houthis have never made it out all the way to Hadramaut at this point in any substantial form. The air campaign, April forward, was not that effective at defeating the al-Houthis. They adjusted to the airstrikes. We saw the tactics change, and the target set started changing because the al-Houthis adjusted. It meant that the al-Houthis weren't sitting in the Yemeni military bases anymore. They were sitting in industrial complexes. So we've seen the Saudis start targeting them. I will tell you that I do not believe the Saudis intend to kill Yemeni civilians. that they believe that they are targeting al-Houthi military targets. But of course, the outcome has been a high number of civilian deaths. The road infrastructure has been completely destroyed. And this has implications for what's to come. So the Saudis have hit the Yemeni military bases. They destroyed those. They've destroyed Yemen's weapons caches that they could find. By the way, those are the military bases and the military infrastructure that the United States would then turn to use in its war against AQAP. So that's not an option for us going forward. But they've also destroyed the road infrastructure and the bridges. Saada, and so in North Yemen, it's a mountainous region. The bridges are necessary in order to move goods at any reasonable pace. They've been taken out, and that's making it increasingly harder for Yemenis to move about and for humanitarian aid to come. I think that one component that we've missed discussing today has been the effect that the Iran deal has had on how I've seen the U.S. engage with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. I think that there's a fear that the United States, and it's probably a very good fear, that the United States will be seen as siding only with Iran. And so from my perspective, I think we've given Iran a little bit more of a green card, or not Iran, excuse me, Saudi Arabia a little bit more leverage in what it can do in Yemen for fear of looking as though we're protecting the al-Houthis or backing Iranian interests. It's obviously not going to work. We're still being blamed for siding with Iran. Iranians are blaming us, and the Houthis are blaming us for siding with Saudi Arabia. I think that we need to be pursuing a course of action that's best for American interests and not trying to balance as much in terms of our own perspective of what's happening in the region.
But I got to go do my duty. So thanks for letting me be here today, and I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Morgan Burndyke, and I'm with Tesla Government Incorporated. You've all spoken a lot today about local grievances and some of the legitimate concerns that Yemenis have. Ms. Zimmerman, you in particular talked about potentially co-opting local militias or smaller groups as a solution for some of the military and political problems that exist in Yemen now. Does a stable solution in Yemen have to result in a single democratic state, or under what conditions would circumstances would a bifurcated state solution be a stable political result in Yemen? Thank you.
I think that we do need a unitary state in Yemen. I have looked at it and tried to figure out how to slice and dice the country, but fundamentally it is a single unit. Yemenis do identify as Yemenis. They have other layers of identity. The Hadramis have always been Hadramis. You can walk through tribal and local identities too, but they will also say that they're Yemeni. I think that the events of the past 8 months show that we really can't have a divided Yemen. The key question here is resources. Why are the al-Houthis looking to push to Aden? Why are they pushing into Marib? Because that's where we have infrastructure that gives access to resources, that give access to very limited funds. You can't have a north-south Yemen divide right now because the South would have all of the petrodollars effectively, and the North wouldn't have any resources, even though it has, correct me if I'm wrong, over 2/3 of the population. So you create this huge structural imbalance in the country. I do think that we need to push for a unitary state. It needs to be an inclusive government and a representative government seen as legitimate in the eyes of the people, which, I will characterize the past government as really not having that legitimacy on the ground.
Can we get a Yemeni perspective on whether there should be Yemen?
Politically speaking, we will not be able to go back to that political structure of the 1990 Republic of Yemen that we know. Things will change. I think on the ground right now, we have some sort of de facto decentralization of power. Some sort of a federal, I think Yemenis, a lot of them are sensitive with the word federal. Let's call it regionalism, let's call it whatever, advanced decentralization. But for us to have what we call al-Markaz al-Muqaddas, or it's the holy center as the capital, that will not exist anymore. This is my personal belief. I think, and my southern friends were not going to be happy with this, if the southerners would have, with secession, it would have happened by now. I think southerners don't agree amongst themselves. There's a lot of divisions. And distribution of wealth, distribution of power. Last week I was at the Marines Corps University speaking about democracy. I was very impressed with the Marines. We're interested to hear about democracy when it's not a hot topic in DC. And I mentioned that in the late 60s, former President Al-Iriani wrote a booklet, and he said, democracy or massacres in Yemen. And I think we're still in that cycle of violence. We need to realize that for us to have a stable nation, that we need to have the political, powerful elites controlled, and you control them by having state institutions. A lot of people may not agree about the National Dialogue Conference and the outcome. I think it's a good pathway for us to start the conversation. 10 minutes ago, I got the good news that the government in Riyadh accepted to enter direct talks with the Houthis.
All we had to do was hold this
Yes.
this meeting.
Yes.
And
It's not confirmed yet where the location, but they have officially accepted.
AEI impact in the real world.
Yeah,
There you
and
go.
so I'm happy that, with all the troubled news that we were talking about today, that we have something good to share. And I think now, and you mentioned something very important, we need to start talking about post-conflict. We're talking about at least $30 to $40 billion in infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. The next cabinet in Yemen will be a broke cabinet. There's less than 1.7 billion in reserves at this point. That's less than 2 months in expenses. And without you having a functioning government, without a functioning treasury, you're not going to have a functioning government. And then you're going to have this rounds of violence again, and you have issues of reconciliation, and that's expensive. And so there is always a way out of these conflicts, but hope I answered the question.
Thank you. It's an important issue. It comes up a lot, and it comes up in a way that troubles me a lot when people, when Americans and Westerners generally, but Americans are particularly prone to this. Look at these states and say, well, these are artificial borders, and Yemen hasn't been a unitary state in this configuration for that long, and we should just should just split it up, or as our vice president can't get away from, Iraq should be divided into 3. The Iraqis always love it when he says that. The Syrian-Iraq border needs to be changed, and and these are all artificial borders. Here's the thing. I think that Mohammed expressed a lot of the problems that are involved in that in Yemen, and I would just want to generalize them for a minute. Look, I personally, and I suspect that I speak for Katie anyway. I doubt that Mohammed would disagree either. That if people wish to change borders and they have a negotiation and they come to a conclusion and they do it in a peaceful way that people are going to accept, that's fine. There's nothing magical about these borders such that we should be taking the position that if people agree to change them, that we should be fighting them to stop that. That's nonsense. But that's never what we're looking at here. We're looking at the use of force to change borders. And the use of force usually to change borders in a pretty unilateral way that is going to create winners and losers in a big way. And to just say, well, let's just divide the place up. Okay, well, where does the line go? In Iraq, the question was always, okay, who gets Baghdad? It's a divided city. Well, it's a Shia city. Okay, well, I'll tell you something right now. Iraq's Sunni are not going to be okay with saying, oh, okay, well, forget about Baghdad. I guarantee you that that's not going to be okay. And I'm sure that the same is true across the board in Yemen. If you identify, you say, okay, well, we'll just give this part to the south, we'll just give this part. It doesn't work like that. It creates dissatisfaction, it creates losers. If it's done in a way that is in the course of a war, it tends to create the basis for continuing conflict. So we need to be less enthusiastic about that, in my view, in our discussions here as a panacea for these problems. And we need to stop this semi-sophisticated discussion that we're having. I would say it's a pseudo-sophisticated discussion about the artificiality of these borders. Because, look, here's the problem. In a certain basic sense, every border on the continent of Africa and almost every border on the continent of Asia and in the Middle East is artificial. Virtually none of these borders are defensible in some apodictical historical way. I'm not even sure what border would be. But these are generally post-colonial borders that are drawn. If you adopt the principle that any post-colonial border is artificial and therefore should be changed, you have just delegitimized all of the borders on the continent of Africa, in the Middle East, and most of Asia. And you've basically said whoever is the stronger force should be able to impose whatever border structure is. This is nonsense. This is not a world order that we can live in. And so I think we really need to be very, very much more thoughtful about this than a lot of off-the-cuff remarks that are made. Although it is perfectly valid to ask, do we think that a Yemeni perspective on this would lead to, multiple states or something else? Because at the end of the day, if it is acceptable to the Yemeni people and it's going to lead to peace and stability, then I'm in favor of it. And I think that's the sort of resolution that we come to. Next question.
Hi. I heard you.
Please identify yourself.
I'm Mike Sexton. I work at ISW. And when you were talking about the legitimate grievances and the sort of moderate elements within the Houthis, I guess, with the intent that we should be negotiating with them, acknowledging their grievances and everything, how would you suggest that the United States or the West in general legitimize that movement when its slogan and flag are... I was reminded of the general's remarks about appeasement in 1938 and everything. I mean, I'd rather not translate what their flag says, but how do you suggest reconciling a need for peace with something like that?
Oh, why don't you go ahead and translate what their flag says?
I really... Death to America, death to Israel, and something very mean about Jews.
Right, okay.
I think that's a very fair question. The slogan was adopted in a post 9/11 time. The Al-Houthis, if you trace their roots, kind of that movement was happening beforehand. The slogan came about because the Houthis saw then President Saleh as being pushed around by the United States. If you recall, there was a fear of the dialogue or during the build-up to the Iraq War that the United States was simply going to roll through the Middle East and invade every single country that didn't sign up to President Bush's plan. So Saleh kowtowed a bit. Yes, and right. Well, he didn't kowtow as much after the Cole. Yes. So what they were looking at was a government that they were fighting against aligning with the United States, and you started to see this death to America appear. Yes, it is tied to a group that it now has very clear ties to Iran, but that doesn't mean that every single member of the group is signed up to kill Americans. The Al-Houthis have not actually killed an American. There was a breakdown of security in January of 2015. The Al-Houthis were manning checkpoints in Sana'a, in the capital at that point. One of the security guards, a 17-year-old boy with a gun, took a pot shot at an American vehicle in the capital, and there was a concern that would not escalate, but that would occur again and there would be casualties. The Houthis weren't also accepting of direct talks with the United States. From conversations that I've had, the United States tried to reach out again and again on a diplomatic side to have those conversations. The Al-Houthis weren't doing it. It's not clear what the reason was. There was one individual who met with the U.S. and was promptly burned by the Al-Houthis effectively and moved out, not literally, but moved out of.
You need to be careful when you say that these days.
Moved out of the chain of command. So there was a question of trust that was happening. I think the question of trust also came from what the U.S. actions were and what we were saying. We were at that point supporting the National Dialogue Conference outcome, which I agree with Mohammed. A lot of it is very, very good. The part that the Houthis took issue with was the regionalization. For those that aren't aware, there was a last-minute push-through after the national dialogue came out that set the regions in Yemen into 6 regions. It divided the area that the al-Houthis considered to be their own territory. They saw the process itself as being illegitimate, and they said, we need to come back to the table on this issue. And the U.S. was saying, this is how it's going to be. It's going to be part of the Constitution. We're all moving forward. So I think there was a lot at play going on at the time. When you're talking about reconcilables, I believe that those individuals who simply want what they perceive to be their rights recognized, they're happy to do it. I don't think that the fact that it's a U.S. effort or it's a Yemeni effort, maybe Saudi effort right now isn't so good, but I think that they would be willing to come to the table and say, here's what we want, here are our demands, can you meet them, and work out something that would reach those, and that would actually demobilize the Houthis back to what they were originally, which is a political movement. They militarized under Saleh because he took up arms against them. They remained militarized in order to protect their interests. Once their interests are secured, I believe that we would see them demilitarize and return to a political state, and that should be an end goal for us in Yemen.
It's another dichotomy, of the many terrible things that have happened as a result of the emergence, I would say, of a completely caustic political environment in Washington and in the U.S. Has been an all-or-nothing approach to all of these discussions. So if you oppose this particular deal with Iran, then you don't understand the importance of negotiating with your adversaries. I'm all about negotiating with my adversaries. It's quite right to say that those are the people that you need to negotiate with. The problem isn't, my problem again with this deal is not that we were negotiating with the Iranians. I think it's great we were negotiating. I don't like this deal. You can accept the principle of negotiation and not like a particular outcome. And I think the same applies to the Houthis. It's a very good question. How do we handle this? Well, if we have a negotiation with the Houthis in which we surrender to their position and we accept that their position is going to be death to America, death to Israel, bad things to the Jews, and we're all converting to 12 or Shiism, that's not a good deal. That's not a deal that I think we should accept. But we should be negotiating with them, we should be talking to them, and we should be recognizing that you can't have Yemen without having Houthis involved in its governance unless you're going to back some kind of really oppressive dictatorship. And I would have hoped that if we were to learn anything from the last 4 years, it's that the age of that, if you ever thought that was, forget about morally justifiable, if you ever thought that was practicable, the age of that in the Arab world has passed. So we have to have some kind of a discussion with the Houthis. I'm thrilled to hear that the Saudis are willing to do that. We'll see now, the devil is in the details. Getting them to the table is one thing. Getting actually to an agreement and getting it implemented is something else. It would be great if the U.S. would lean into that. And I think, the degree to which we have talked about soft power and smart power and all of those things, and the degree to which we have seen American foreign policy steadily militarized over the last number of years is extremely problematic. And I think Katie made another point that I really want to highlight as well, because it's super important, that we, the United States, most governments, but we in particular, have a prejudice in favor of dealing with the recognized legitimate state structure as it is, because we interact with the world through the State Department, and the State Department is a diplomatic service, and it looks for the legitimate government, and that's what it wants to work through. When it finds that there is no legitimate government, as is the case in Yemen, we start to get very confused. And in an era of state collapse, where we now have collapsed states from Ukraine through Africa, in places that really matter, and I would submit that the likelihood of increased state collapse is high, we've got to wrench ourselves out of this mentality. We've got to recognize that we can't just say we're going to exchange ambassadors with governments. We have to think about how we're going to interact with sub-state actors. Because when there's no meaningful state, those are the only actors you can interact with. And this is something that there's all kinds of structural reasons and reasons why we don't, but we really need to get after this. I think Yemen is in many respects the perfect test case for this. Mohammed, you're smiling. You want to add?
No, I just wanted to say that not just Middle Eastern politics, but in politics in general, don't judge a book by its cover. Slogans, banners, flags, logos are just a poster child for the movement or organization. But I think this is saying, if I translate it correctly from Arabic to English, it's like there's no permanent adversaries in politics. There's no permanent friendships. There's mutual interests. I think at this point, everybody's talking to the Houthis. My biggest critique of what they did over the past few months is that they set the precedent that in Yemen, for you to push for change, you have to do it with a rifle. And that's the unfortunate part, because we were very close. We were very close. Yes, I think that the regional divide of how the Houthi areas were going to be, or the Azal region, was not just because they didn't have resources or seaports, but you don't do what you did in March to prove your point. But that's a classic case for a failed state. When you have a vacuum, someone will fill that vacuum. It could be a political group, it could be a rebellion, it could be a terrorist organization. So it's all about that vacuum and who fills that vacuum and how quick. I think that the Houthis' policy or philosophy in politics was very simple, which a lot of people couldn't understand. It's, why not? Why not? Let's push and see how far we could go. And once people start pushing back, then we will know that's how far we can go. And so
It can be very problematic as a strategy. We have a question over here and then over here.
Hi, Pat Span, just myself. I was going to tell the congressman, unlike him, I did over 30 years with that organization, but that's another story. People earlier on stole my question about whether federalism, because it is an artificial boundary. And I just read, I think his name was Kelly. I just recently read his book written in the 80s, and he was talking about the history of Saudi Arabia and after the 1920s and 30s, how it was created. And it's gotten me to thinking is, if I really don't see a strong central government emerging in these places. What is the likelihood that, going back to remembering the 20s and 30s, the Saudis and the Omanis decide to just carve it up and make additional provinces of their two countries?
Mm.
at this point, I don't think they're interested in carving up any part of Yemen and annexing it. It's
I'm old enough to remember when there was Aden in Yemen.
yeah. We've been in a protracted conflict since the 60s. Every decade there was a war in Yemen, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. Why? It's basically two things: distribution of wealth and distribution of power. That was always the reason why. Like, each faction wants to control it, and they couldn't reach an agreement or a social contract or whatever you want to call it that will allow the distribution of wealth and the distribution of power. When you have protracted conflicts for years, your national identity erodes, and you start identifying yourself when you're tribal, in your village, whether your religious background, and that's the most dangerous thing happening in Yemen right now. I'm seeing in my hometown in Taiz, people are identifying themselves with heroes from the 60s, defining the region as the plateau. So this is no longer just a north-south issue or an east-south or west issue. A lot of people would be like, maybe, the foreign powers divided and conquers. I don't like to blame the foreign powers for everything that goes wrong in your country. I think we in Yemen had a problem that we couldn't address, and it's easy to just blame a foreigner, an outsider on the issue. We have to step up and take responsibility. And I think, if anything, I hope this war was a wake-up call that, we can't keep getting into this war every 10 years. Every 10 years a different conflict. It's getting, and the conflict gets worse, it gets more violent, So I hope this will be a wake-up call that, we need to figure out a social contract where all these players will coexist.
Hi, I'm Gary Sargent. Run a small consulting firm, TS Light. I'm a retired Army Special Forces officer by trade, and I spent some time as a FAO in a couple of places, to include Beirut. My question really is on this whole, what the congressman said, and he took off too early, was the pumps and wingtips thing, and how do we engage better? Because I was at an embassy that was sort of very locked down by diplomatic security service, not allowing for that day-to-day engagement that I think is really critical and brings you to the next step, which is talking to the non-state actors in the country. How big's the U.S. mission in Yemen today? Can somebody tell me that?
Well, it's not in Yemen, so there's the start.
Correct. That's what I'm saying.
I think that's a great question, and it's one that actually our diplomats who have served in Yemen have criticized the policies and the fact that they aren't able to go out more. It's obviously a careful balance between security and the effectiveness, but I think that today we are so risk averse that we're not able to allow our personnel, military and diplomatic, to do their jobs.
Guys in Afghanistan
It's an issue, and it's one where under Saleh, I had heard stories that our American personnel had limited authorities to go to different regions or had to receive permission. And Mohammed, maybe you can change my intelligence on that. But there was some control over who the United States was talking to. We weren't able to go down and talk to certain power brokers in certain regions because they were seen as being in opposition to President Saleh. That changed to some degree when Saleh came out and Hadi came in. But again, the security at that time was so low, and it was also in a post-Benghazi atmosphere. The United States, I believe, felt as though it couldn't afford to lose another diplomat in that sort of violent attack. And we reined in our personnel. Stories from individuals I know who were serving in the Yemeni embassy when it was in Sana'a said that they literally had a 500-meter leash that they could go on, which took them from the embassy to their bunks across the road. The United States bought the hotel that was right there, and that's where we put up our personnel to keep them safe. What that meant was that we didn't have contact with the people that we needed to. When we relocated our embassy outside of Yemen into Saudi Arabia, we lost insight into what was happening in Sana'a. So the United States withdrew its embassy far before the conflict broke out to what it was. We were actually maintaining military personnel in southern Yemen until March. But we didn't have insight into what was going on in the north, which meant we weren't involved in those political debates and that dialogue. We weren't able to shape it. We didn't understand the players. We didn't understand what they wanted. And I think that is a critical weakness in how we've been engaging in Yemen. And we need to be able to understand the problem before we can fix it. And we need to be able to shape the outcome. And we simply weren't there to do it.
Recently, I was talking to a Western friend who she's been traveling back and forth in Yemen for years. Brave woman, very brave. Goes to very difficult places, very passionate about the country. And I was shocked by something she said. She said, "This is the first time in my life that I don't feel safe walking in the streets and I have to wear a burqa or a veil to cover up." So it's a lot of people, including myself, we used to, criticize everybody, just, get out, meet, and greet, build contacts. But it's not safe. It's not a safe place. It's not an easy question of there are people who would like to go and talk, and I think at one point we could have had that door open. But at this point, this week, members of the Arab coalitions were kidnapped. I don't know if it's public news or not. I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. Good. I keep forgetting. I keep forgetting I'm not a spokesman anymore, so I could talk freely. It will take some time for me to adjust.
But then my question would be off of that is, when you don't leave, you just ramp up a little bit with a little bit of security detail or something to make you feel a little safer, but you engage with the people.
You could engage regionally. You know, if it's not safe, you can invite people in a neutral ground. You could meet and engage. But I mean, it's just, I mean, the issue of security, it's very serious. Where, you know, I've had friends who were kidnapped in Yemen, and I had to be the person that called them their parents and be like, you know, sorry, like an incident happened and we're gonna solve it. It's tough. It's tough when you're on the other end. Until till Damascus in 04. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, this is a general problem, and there's not an easy solution to this. I mean, I have seen not pumps and wingtips, but civilians can actually wear boots too. I mean that I've actually seen that, and even State Department types can get muddy and wear body armor and boots and go out and do things. And I've seen a lot of terrific and very, very courageous people, and I've mourned some of those who were killed from the State Department, from the diplomatic service, from USAID in Iraq, Afghanistan. These are people who also risk their lives and are willing to risk their lives. And there is a balance that needs to be struck here, because any time that you're either asking or allowing people to risk their lives, you have to, there's a responsibility that weighs on the president and everyone who is involved in issuing those orders. And you have to weigh the risk and the potential sacrifice against the benefit to national security and the safety of the American people, which is what we're working for. And I think the problem is that it is very difficult for the State Department to make those kinds of decisions, because it's not, this isn't about banging on the State Department. I'm a big fan of the State Department. The State Department does wonderful things. Some of my best sisters-in-law are in the State Department. I have a lot of admiration for that organization, but the State Department is fundamentally a diplomatic service. And we keep, as a nation, asking it to perform a lot of other functions that are not the functions of a diplomatic service, but we expect it and we give it and we require it to have the structure of a diplomatic service. So what's a regional security officer? The regional security officer, who is the RSO, the dreaded RSO, who sets the rules for how far people under U.S. Mission control, the authority of the mission can move. The mission of an RSO is to have no casualties among his or her people. That is the mission of an RSO. The RSO is not supposed to be making calculations about acceptable loss rates. The acceptable loss rate for an RSO is 0. And that's very understandable. That's, if you're a diplomatic service and a diplomatic corps, that's the right attitude. So this is a structural thing, this is a psychological thing, this is a mindset thing, and America really is going to need to wrap its head around this. We really are going to have to wrestle with this, because the truth is, from a national security standpoint, from the standpoint of doing what we need to do in the world in order to be secure, in order to pursue our interests, we have to allow people not in uniform, not in non-uniform of other government agencies, we have to allow people to take risks, and we're going to have to ask people to take risks sometimes. But we haven't worked this all through in our own minds. And I think that that's something that we really need to take on. But the problem is that as long as we continue to be conflicted about whether we should be involved in the world at all, it's very hard to have a discussion about how much risk an RSO should be asked to take. And so there's a fundamental problem that I would submit that we have before we even get to this practical question. And the fundamental problem is this: do we think that we have vital interests, that our national security requires us to be engaged in the problems that we're talking about today in Yemen, we're talking about in the Middle East writ large? If the answer to that question is no, then these discussions are all interesting and academic, but we shouldn't be asking people to risk their lives for things if we don't have a vital national interest there. I think the answer is yes. I think the answer is very clearly yes. And I think in that circumstance, we need to dismiss from our minds the notion that we can just do this from safe, sanitized standoff distances with joysticks. because that's not working, and there are reasons why that's not going to work. And that's going to require wrestling with the complexities. If this sounds like a peroration heading toward a conclusion to this event, it is. No more questions. I'm sorry. So we have to be prepared to grapple with the complexity of this. And that's what Katie has done. We have a long report, which I commend to you. We have copies available. It's available online as well. It has a lovely black cover. We like this a lot. We have it's a sour joke among those of us who study terrorist groups like this that we feel like they say to each other, "How black is your black flag?" So we're adopting that as well. How black is your black cover? This is not the future of Yemen, I hope. I hope it's not the future of any country in the region. It is something that we're going to have to deal with. We can't solve it, goes without saying, but we can help. And the first thing that we need to do is understand. And that's something that Katie has taken on in this. You'll be happy to know, those of you who are lost with the names and acronyms, we have actually an appendix back here with names and acronyms, so we will help you understand the players as well as the conflict. But most of all, we have a series of recommendations to put on the table. And they may be right, they may be wrong, but this is an offer. And I think that it's very valuable. I commend Katie very much for fighting through this and doing it. And I hope that we can leave this discussion today and move on from this report and talk more about what should we be doing, what do we have to do, and try to get to a serious discussion about that. So I thank you all for coming. Katie, congratulations, and thank you for report. Mohammed, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. You have a card or you don't?
I don't.